Each city has its own character. So we have to find, in a sense, the response or answer to the question of sustainability in the context of each city. In some cities, you have great economic challenges. In others, you have social challenges. In others, you have environmental challenges. And in most of them, you have a mix of all of these. So keeping the balance, in some senses, is the essence of sustainability. And we're talking about a balance not over 5 years or 10 years, but over a few hundred years. Because great cities like your own here survive for thousands of years. If you go back to the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, it's about trying to maintain what we have today without taking from the future from our children. But there's also another very important concern, which was not so strong in the Brundtland definition, which is about intergenerational equity. It's about poverty today. It's about giving opportunities to all people today, not only about the future. So it's balancing the present and inequality, access, and the future, balancing the interests not only of human need, but also of ecosystems. Balancing the interests of all human groups. So we have to deal with questions of vulnerability, of gender, of ethnicity, of diversity. All of them come together. And that's why, as I said, each city has to find its own answer. Yes, of course. It is quite complex in some ways. But on the other hand, there are some basic things that you need to achieve quite simply. I think there is an agreement across the world that within a generation or less, we have to end absolute poverty. Turkey is now much better off than many of its neighbors. It's a middle-income country. Economically, for the last few years, we've been doing pretty well. So you don't see the kind of extreme poverty that you find in many other parts of the world. But when you have Syrian refugees coming in, you see the face of that on the street every day. I saw that. Young children at the street corners. So it exists in the world. And we have the ability to try and end it, not only in our own environments, but in other places. Because if it's not ended everywhere, it'll come back to haunt us somewhere else. And wherever you go in the world, whether you look at homeless people in New York, or in London, or people in informal settlements in Istanbul, that challenge is everywhere. Because some people do not have the opportunity in their lifetimes to accumulate enough capital to be able to own their own houses or to have adequate water. So we have to look at providing adequate conditions for housing or upgrading slums, whatever you call different things in different places. That's the other thing that's quite critical and tied to that. So I can only give impressions from a few things that I've read and a visit that I made here 20 years ago. And all I can say is the city has changed dramatically. It's sort of almost unrecognizable. But what I would say is, from the little history that I've read of Istanbul and before that, before it was called Istanbul, it was called Constantinople, etc., is 2 or 3 things. The first thing is, the most interesting thing about the city is that it's strategically exceedingly well placed. It was chosen, the site was chosen very carefully. And one of the considerations in that site, which may have been a strategic consideration at that point of time, it was often so for large cities or capitals as they were evolved, was that in the region certainly, and potentially within the walls of the city, the people in the city could survive for a very long period of time. And if you look at the history of the city has survived at that time, before whatever, the 15th century, it has survived many, many attacks from the outside. And what does that mean? It means that people were able to survive with the water, with the food, with whatever the hell they had inside that urban environment. That was a different world, but the principle still applies. The principle is that an urban environment, especially in the 21st century, has to exist within the bounds of the resources that are there in its environment. Now, of course, large metropolitan cities like Istanbul or Tokyo or Shanghai, etc., draw resources from across the globe. You import things, you export things, and they would not be so if it were otherwise. In fact, the great history of this city was in the fact that it controlled trade across Asia and Europe for whatever, almost 1,000 years. That was the centrality of the city, that's why it was so important. But given a city like Istanbul is a primate city of this country, it's the largest concentration of population, it is what, maybe a third of the economic output. You concentrate opportunity. So people get jobs, you create tremendous value added, but you also concentrate risk, whether it's of climate change or of water security or of civil strife. That's the interesting thing about cities. You have to keep the balance between the opportunity and the risk that it creates, right? So what happens in an earthquake? You bring together all your economic activity, all your buildings in one place, and then if there's a big shake and a lot of it gets destroyed, it has a huge impact on the economy and of course society, whatever it is. So we have to balance these things out in effective ways, and that's why I'm saying if you only look to the short run and we build cities very quickly and we don't strengthen the buildings strong enough, we don't invest in them, then 20 years from now that short-termism may actually add up to a huge disaster, because you may find 20% of your building stock is actually destroyed. So you have to keep that, you have to keep the balance between those two things, and it's not a trade-off. You have to be able to try and look both, with two eyes open at the same time.